Today on Superhero Ethics, we're talking about Star Trek Picard with two special guests, both of whom have been podcast heroes of mine, and I'm really excited to have them be part of this conversation. Let me also say that as we discuss Star Trek Picard, we're going to be discussing the show in its entirety with spoilers for pretty much everything that's happened this season, as well as pretty much anything else that's happened in a Star Trek show. So if you don't want to be spoiled, go watch Picard. We talk about some frustrations we have with it on this episode, but it is a very good show for the most part. So just wanted to give you that spoiler warning in case you do want to watch it now and then hit pause and then come back to this in a couple days or a couple weeks once you're fully caught up. All that and more right after this commercial break that we have no control over. If you've been a long-time listener to this show, you've heard me talk about a couple of things that have inspired me. One, you've probably heard me talk about how my mother had me watching Star Trek at an early age, and then she and I would sit and talk about the episodes and the kind of questions it raised and how that really kind of shaped my whole approach to media. And you've probably heard me talk about podcasts like the MCU Cast and DC On Screen and the Star Trek Universe podcast, and how they really helped kind of inspire me and to get this podcast started and to take it in the new directions it has been. Well, I'm excited because this week we're bringing all that together. We are talking today about the Star Trek Picard, the new Star Trek show that aired on CBS and I believe is on Netflix now. And we're going to talk some of those questions. And my two guests are Matthew Carroll and David C. Roberson of those two podcasts, respectively. So let me give them a chance to introduce both themselves and probably correct my pronunciations of their name. Matt, how are you doing today?
It's Matthew. It's Matthew.
Yeah, okay. I give him stuff all the time for calling me Matt.
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. Excited to be here. Excited to talk about Picard because we don't do enough of that. And yeah, always. And to specifically get into the ethics of it because that's a different lens, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And just to say a word about where you're coming from in terms of the other podcasts you do.
Oh, all kinds of them. The most applicable to this discussion is the Star Trek Universe podcast, but I also do the Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast, as well as the Matthew Carroll podcast, and a bunch of other kind of one-off things, like we do the Orville Universe podcast together. Me and Matthew Westfox here have been doing the Bingers Assemble episodes for Altered Carbon lately, so a lot of things going on. Stranded Panda, strandedpanda.com, you can check out where a lot of our shows are.
I've talked about Stranded Panda and this podcast being a part of it. Matthew and Dave are two of the kind of original podcast hosts that helped put that together. So, Dave, want to say hello and tell us a little bit about where you're coming from?
Hi, everyone. I'm David C. Roberson.
Roberson.
No T, no I-N. No. I am from DC On Screen, where we talk about the DC Universe on film and television. I'm from the Star Trek Universe podcast with Matt. Matt and I have been talking about Star Trek since we were like 5.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's awesome.
And I've just started a new podcast called Breaking Bond. And my wife and I have never really watched any of the James Bond movies, so we are sitting down and checking those out and talking about them. And we've done 3 episodes, and
nice.
I'm having a lot of fun.
Cool. Are you starting from the beginning and going through in chronological order?
We are. We started at the 1954 live adaptation of Casino Royale with Barry Nelson as James Bond.
Oh, okay.
That was such a Dave way to start, by the way. I listened to that episode and I was like, what are you doing? You're watching some weird grainy black and white YouTube video of a live TV play instead of starting with Dr. No. Come on. Do this as a bonus later. Come on.
If we're going to go to the original, we're going to go to the original.
Peter Lorre was the villain.
That does sound good. I want to watch that movie and listen to that. And I didn't realize that you guys have actually been friends that long and talking about Trek that long. So let me just start there. For both of you, what is it that kind of pulls you in about Trek? What's made you love it and made you want to keep talking about it for however many decades that is?
It's a really good question, Dave. For you, it's sort of inborn, like you were raised on the stuff. I kind of was. I was like 6 or 7 years old. My parents were watching The Next Generation, and I don't even understand why, because they're in no way nerdy and in no way Star Trek fans, really. But for some reason, they watched it every week. I guess my dad kind of liked genre stuff. And so I got I hated it. I was like, why are we watching this boring show? But then slowly I got to where I really loved the Geordi and Data relationship and just Data in general, I think. And that slowly kind of like opened me up to it. And then me and Dave went to church together. We met when we were 5 or 6 years old. And, it was something that we could talk about at church. And so he introduced me to the original series and all the other stuff, over the years. And so now we've been having this conversation for 30 years, about as each one of these series came out. Literally like almost the very beginning of TNG, we were, 5 and 6 years old watching that. So
that's awesome.
And we've done a strange dance of pulling each other back in over the years.
That's true.
I can see that.
Because like I would grab it and be like, hey, original series. And then a few weeks or years later or whatever, he'd be like, dude, are you watching DS9? No, I got out of it. No, watch it. And then, he went off to we both went off to college. And then I was like, dude, are you watching Enterprise? No, here, I've got tapes. So, but yeah, no, I've been watching it since like I was born into it. Like my parents would watch and my parents aren't nerdy either, but they would watch the original series. And, it wasn't any great ethical reason that I was sucked in at that age or anything. I just liked Starship. I liked Enterprise in space.
Yeah.
And I liked Mr. Spock and I liked Bones. I like those characters, those very standout archetypes. I've obviously come to appreciate the allegories. But really, I like Star Trek. I just like, they could do whatever. I'm not beholden to any kind of Roddenberry ideal. I'm just like, I just want good stories. And,
my mother would watch some of TNG with me, and she kind of used it almost as a history lesson because she loved to talk about the idea of, she loved Roddenberry, but then thought that a lot of Roddenberry's ideas wouldn't work today. And when I would ask, because she was very much a flower child, and when I asked her about the 60s, she would often say, the best way to understand the hope of the 60s is to watch the original Star Trek, and then contrast that with watching something like some of the more modern Star Treks, which I thought was such an interesting insight in terms of talking about how, Roddenberry's ideas made so much sense in the 60s, but then with some of the more recent series, having a little more interpersonal conflict and a little more, less quite full utopianism kind of made more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So at what point would she say that? Because it makes me curious, because what point did she think TNG? Is that what she was talking about at that point? Or is this even later than that?
I think a little bit TNG, but mostly more like the DS9. And then some of the movies and stuff like that, yeah.
DS9 is definitely the Federation is not the good guys. I think that's the only show that the Federation isn't really the good guys. It's good people in the Federation, but there's a lot of other characters.
The thing about the original series, though, is that I don't think it follows Gene Roddenberry's quote-unquote vision because he hadn't had it yet. I feel like when you watch the original series, there's always that problematic Commodore or Admiral or whatever you want to call him, who are like, no, Kirk, you're going to do this thing that I want you to do. And he's like, nope, but the moral imperative says to do this. There's always that guy. There's lots of like weird racism from Bones about Spock. There's, stuff like the guy in Balance of Terror who's like saying that Spock is a traitor because he looks like a Romulan, and Kirk says, you keep prejudice in your quarters, mister. There's lots of interpersonal conflict on the original series. So I just kind of always call horse hockey on the Roddenberry ideal as far as the original series is concerned.
Well, you also have to judge it based on the time period it's in and like...
Well, the very fact that a human being on a Federation starship serving in the Federation would have racism...
Right.
is totally antithetical to what Gene preaches.
Right.
Or what he preached
later on
before his death.
Yeah. It's kind of like I often think of the Gene Roddenberry thing as he slowly sort of believed his own mythos of what he built. And obviously it's a hopeful future because we've solved disease and scarcity and all of that. It's a post-scarcity society.
Sort of, but Trouble with Tribbles, they had to get that quadritriticale to those colonists, they
well, but they had it. That's a transportation issue, not a scarcity issue. Like in a post-scarcity society, you still have issues of getting it to the people, but there was an organization who is designed to get it to those people. You know, that's the whole thing.
And certainly I think there's always been a tension between what Roddenberry's ideal was and where that came out, what the network would let them get away with. And also, as I think just always happens, like, you know, what your understanding of hope is based on that, you know, particular point in time. Like, I think in a lot of ways, Roddenberry probably thought that what he was creating was a world of, you know, complete, you know, gender and sexual freedom in terms of like that women could have powerful roles in Starfleet. They'd all be walking around in tiny skirts and Kirk would be romancing all of them.
Right.
But, you know, by the standards of the day, that was what it could go for.
It's very woke by the standards of the day. It definitely pushed boundaries for its time, but it is, you know, it has its problematic areas as well.
Like any piece of media, I think.
Sure. Absolutely.
Well, and so let me turn it to Star Trek. So given what you guys like about Star Trek, and I know I heard some of this on the Star Trek Universe podcast and on your lead up to Picard, but I'd love to talk about it here. What were the things you were most excited about seeing in Picard? And how do you kind of feel like the show paid off those hopes? We all have problems with the last episode of Picard. You guys did a great episode on that I'm sure I'll put up a link to, but not to get just too stuck on that, but although it's a part of the show, but just kind of like, what were some topics to see explored or character moments you were hoping for that you either did or didn't get with this season of Picard?
For me, the biggest thing that I didn't get and that it was the thing I was most excited for, and it was the thing I didn't get. And so it is my biggest disappointment with the show. And it's exactly what we've been talking about. I think that in the Next Generation era of Trek, particularly the Next Generation and Voyager, and probably and less so on Enterprise and not at all on DS9, they did have this view of the Federation that they're sort of there's no friction between them. You know, the right. People on the ships work together, and they're kind of this perfect society, and they're sort of proselytizing their version of culture to the rest of the galaxy. And I don't really love that storyline. I much prefer a complex group of people trying to do good, and they're struggling with what is right and wrong. Like, that's what I like, and I think they do that more in different versions of Trek. And when I saw all the stuff about the synth ban, and I saw that coming, and I thought we were going to get a really good complex story about the Federation really turning its back on a form of life. And we did get that, but it turned out it was an evil plan of a cabal of Romulan people, and then that really undercut what I really wanted out of it, which I would have much rather it just be genuine fear of people causing this, because I think that's more of a real story. And I just didn't. I thought the whole Jat Vash conceit really weakened what I wanted the show to be.
Not to dive into the other Star type fandom, but I've often said as a Star Wars fan that one of my least favorite moments in the entire media work of Star Wars, it comes in the second of the prequel movies, when it's revealed that Count Dooku has the whole time actually been working for the Emperor. Because, I am so much more interested in a story where different people all have different motivations that seem like the right idea to them, but it's causing this 3, 4, 5-way conflict. And so I had that same moment towards the end of Picard of when we found out that actually just everything was being motivated by this one driving force, and it was really coming down to just two sides. It made it a lot more simplistic than I had hoped.
Talking about ethics, and for me, this is sort of meta ethics, but it's like, for me, presenting shows where you always have a good and a bad guy, and having one team kind of always be the good guys, which in the most of the history of Trek, that is the Federation, it simplifies things to the point where you can put yourself in the shoes of the protagonist and go, good guys are good, and I am one of them. You know what I mean? And I think self-analysis is incredibly important. And when you're looking at these, and this show, if it would have been, hey, what are we doing as a world and as a nation that we've lost our way? Like that's what I thought the story they were trying to tell. And instead it kind of just simplified it. And that from a meta ethics point of view, I wanted the show to really try to go there and explore those questions of fear.
Yeah, I think the original series, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, they've all done a better job in a lot of ways of presenting situations where Yes, the Federation are the good guys until the captain has to stand up to the bureaucracy of it all.
Yeah.
I think they really dropped the ball on Picard here. But the thing I was most excited for, and I didn't even know I was until I saw that first trailer, was 7 of 9. Because I was like, yes, finally we're going to get some kind of character development for 7 of 9.
Yes. And it doesn't involve Chakotay in any way, shape, or form.
You know what? I wouldn't mind if it did, just
Okay.
as long as it made sense.
Yeah, that's fair.
Don't just spring it on me.
I cannot believe that they did it again to her with Raffi.
I know.
Just cannot believe it.
That was like theirs and the writers, like that was their suggestion too. It was like Jerry Ryan was like, I think we had like a moment of chemistry in this episode. And the writers were like, us too.
Yeah.
It feels like a meta joke.
It does.
They're like, hey, you hated when we did it last time. Here it is again.
That should be like, we had this one moment of chemistry. So how about that be a theme for season 2? Is this long, drawn out, will they, won't they plot line? You know, not just like, oh, look, they're together. But
it looks like they are. They are. There's no will they, won't they. They are.
Yeah.
They are. And the difference, though, of course, is that we have a second season coming.
Yeah, that's true.
The coronavirus ever goes away.
And it is interesting to me also the two things you're bringing up, because I think they're kind of connected. Because to me, this is the kind of thing when I think about kind of ethical and moral questions on this show is when instead of it being good guys and bad guys, it's different people with different motivations, and that they're all the good guys in their own heads. And Dave, I think you're both right. We get that in almost every series. To me, the pinnacle of that is DS9. You know, where you have often the Federation has their agenda and the Bajorans have their agenda, and neither one of them are bad. They're just not the same.
Yeah.
And Cisco sometimes is one side or the other, and the wormhole aliens are one side or the other, and even people like the Cardassians in characters like Garrick, and even like the Ferengi in characters like Quark. They're not bad or good. They're just people who have their agendas. And that's, I think, what I really wanted out of the season of Star Trek. The idea that, like, you know, the androids are doing this and the Romulans are doing this and the Federation is doing this. One of the things I think I was most disappointed with was the Romulan storyline. Because what I thought we were going to get, I'm wondering if you guys also thought we were going in this direction, but I thought this from the trailers, and especially from episodes 1 and somewhat episode 2, was that we were going to get the Federation has long been the diehard enemy of the Romulans and vice versa. The Romulans have gone through this horrible catastrophe, and the Federation didn't really respond the way they should have. And now everyone's having to adjust to this totally new world where the Romulans aren't warlike and crazy because they can't be anymore. But they're still holding some grudges against the Federation, and the Federation has to kind of let go of its fear and resentment about the Romulans because the Romulans are decimated. Did you guys get that sense, or was I just all headcanoning that from the trailers?
Well, less than I don't know if it's the trailers, but the episode where he goes to Elnor's planet, Absolute Candor, and meets a lot of Romulans, I really got that sense. I was like, oh, they very much set up exactly what you're talking about, but then in the end, it's just a Romulan fleet versus a Federation fleet. Good guys versus bad guys. And not to jump too far into this to a completely different topic, but like that's one of the biggest ethical problems in the series for me, that it isn't even really explored. You just assume Picard is right because he's Picard. And at least the show seems to presume that Picard is right because he's Picard about pretty much everything in this show.
Well, his name is the show.
Yeah, no. But that doesn't mean he has to be right, you know?
I mean, have you ever seen Dexter? Dexter's name is the show, and he's the protagonist. He's not the hero. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
So the biggest problem for me is, in the end of the story, the Zhat Vash have been on this mission to stop the androids from destroying all life, which is a valuable mission if it's true. And then basically they find out it is true. This mythology they believe in is true. And the beings that are down there are about to destroy all life in the in the universe, I guess. And then Picard fights for those androids, which I like, you know, is a beautiful sentiment. And it really is. And it's you put it well, Dave. We were talking about this in the chat. It's the story of just like sort of practicality versus if you help me out with the word.
Yeah, it was the principle versus the greater good.
Right.
Yeah.
Something like that.
This is something we talk about all the time with like Section 31 and stuff like that, making those hard decisions. But I gotta say, like, the idea that Picard didn't even think, maybe we should destroy these androids. Like, they are about to destroy us. And maybe I shouldn't stop the Romulans. Like, that's a big decision to make for the universe.
But if Picard thought that way, he would be just as guilty as the Federation was with, like, maybe we should let the Romulans die. They've always been a threat.
Yes.
I didn't think the writers were always presenting Picard as a hero. I think they were trying to show him as flawed in some ways. They just didn't do a very good job of it all the time. We've been ragging on the show a lot, and I do want to say I love the show for the most part. There's just some real problems towards the end and how it wraps up certain questions. And I want to go back to the thing about the Zhat Vash, but just on Picard, to me, I think what it shows more than anything is his arrogance. Because I think he doesn't see it as, I'm choosing the androids over the universe. I think he sees it as, and it's almost a very kind of, this is a very core Star Trek idea. You know, he thinks, if I use logic and reason and my big, big brain, I can convince the androids not to destroy the universe. And that's better than killing the androids, because either way, we will not destroy the universe, but my way is safer and better for everyone. And it's that kind of hubris of, I think it never occurs to him that he might not convince them, and thus, because of his efforts, the whole universe might get destroyed.
Yeah. Like, this would be a way you could solve that in a storytelling perspective. You have him say, I want you to stop, and I can't stop this fleet, but I am going to die for you. I'm going to, like, go try my best to save you because I believe in you. And if my death, but instead he, like, actually tries to stop the Romulans from stopping them. And it's like, I don't know that he should stop them. Like, they're trying to stop. I mean, needs of the many, like, needs of the many in this case is like a lot. And I know we can have that discussion about, like, yeah, but that'd have to be the androids' choice. But if the androids have banded together to destroy all life, which at that point they had, you kind of have to make that call.
There's a weird way in which it seems like Patrick Stewart is being typecast, because the idea of, I want to care for this incredibly powerful being or group of beings who you all want to kill because they have the potential to be incredibly destructive, but I think that I can save them and thus make them not destructive. I mean, that's Professor X just as much as it is Picard, isn't it?
For sure.
And I honestly have a lot of thoughts about X-Men and how ridiculous it is that, they're like, or we are as an audience supposed to go, yeah, they shouldn't be registered. They should totally be registered.
Yeah, no, I'm very much I'm Team Tony and Magneto. We have an episode actually coming out on ethical villainy, in which I talk about why I think Magneto is more the hero than Professor X. So I'm with you there.
I mean, you wouldn't want to be a mutant and registered in, like, a Trump administration, but normally, hey, these are crazy running around weapons here. Running amok. If
I'm going into a casino, I want to know who can read my mind and who can affect the odds. That seems fair.
The thing for me is I wish that in these stories, when X or Picard or anyone else played by Patrick Stewart would, like, be confronted with that, he would treat it as a choice. Like, he would realize, this person, the government wants to stop them, but I don't think they should, or I think they should be given a choice. He should have to weigh that in his mind, or we should see him have to make that decision instead of just being like, no, all principle, no greater good. You know what I mean? Like, I'm more of a Cisco man.
Here it seems like the writers almost fall into the same kind of ethical problem they were starting to say the Federation does, because it kind of feels like towards the end, the reason why Picard thinks, of course, I have to side with the androids is because it's against the Romulans, and the Romulans are the enemy. I think that was the thing that I was really disappointed by, especially, was we start out with so much like Picard is on the side of the Romulans. Picard is able to empathize with the Romulans. And so to have that just be switched, I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Let me go back to the idea, though, of that the Romulans were right, because the one thing I would push back on there, because here I thought the show did something really interesting, is Do you think it's that the Romulans were right that the androids are this incredible terror? Or is it something of a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because it does seem like that the reason why the androids want to use this power is because the Romulans are now coming to kill them. So that there's kind of a chicken and the egg thing there, isn't there?
Well, sure. The reason the androids want to kill is because organic life wants to extinguish them. Like, that's the whole point. But they had these visions. They had the admonition. They definitely could have gone to the androids and said, hey, we found this admonition, but we don't plan to do that. But I think that the part of the whole thing is you also don't get a sense that the Romulans necessarily even had a choice in the matter, because they found this admonition that drove a lot of them nuts and made them fear and hate androids. So even from there's a bad guy in this, even the bad guys are being controlled by a thing they can't possibly understand because it wasn't meant for them. So I don't know. There's it's layer upon layer of lack of ethics or lack of any sort of decision making happening.
It's lack of agency. I think is a big part of the show.
I'm looking for. Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because in some ways they really explore that in great ways. I thought one of my favorite parts of the show, and Dave, I'm wondering if you agree with this because it involves the character you talk about, is when Seven is confronted with whether or not she will take control of the Borg Collective. Because she's in this situation where they're going to die if she doesn't do this, and then presumably so will the other drones. But it also seems like it goes so against everything she believes in to kind of re-enslave or reconnect these Borg to the collective, especially because what I think is one of my favorite moments when Elnor says, well, but can't you just turn it off when you need to? And she says the problem is that I won't want to, and they won't want me to either. What was kind of your take on that scene and the decision she makes there?
My take is basically that sometimes you have to do, and this seems to be Seven's. This is where Seven lives now. You have to do unsavory things for the betterment of the universe, right? And I'm of the belief that Seven never quite escaped from slavery on Voyager. Like, she was excised from the Borg Collective, where she was a slave to the hive mind, and then became a crew member of Voyager, where she was slave to the hive mind. The Maquis didn't escape it. Why would she? You step aboard Voyager for some reason. You're a part of the Federation. You're Starfleet, and you have to do everything by the book. You have to do what Janeway says. Right. So I think it's really interesting to actually see her pushing forward. And did I miss something? Did she ever say why she stopped being a part of Starfleet after Voyager?
She said the same thing that basically she felt the same way Picard did about the Federation.
It was the Romulans.
Yeah, well, not just the Romulans, but they're the Fenris Rangers. That whole area of space, it's the Fenris area or whatever. Right. The Fenris sector.
Yeah, they abandoned it.
Yeah, I think that area is supposed to be the neutral zone, what we knew of as the neutral zone before, and they abandoned it, and so now there's just a bunch of crime lords and sort of despots sort of taking control of various planets, and there's not an overarching government from either side, and so it's become sort of the Wild West.
See, that's awesome.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I love seeing characters break out of the Federation, even when it's just on the normal series, and something happens. They're like, nope, that shit ain't right. Yeah, I'm doing this instead. And I love that that's where Seven lives now. I love it that she killed her ex, and who wouldn't? I mean,
the Jazel.
The way she killed Icheb, the way she has just been torturing, and oh my god, put her out, take her out of her misery. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved Seven's development. I think you make a really good observation there about how, I think this is something very relatable. I mean, in our own world, there's a lot of evidence that if you grow up in kind of very rigid societies, certainly cults, but even things that are not quite like that, but we're still you're given very rigid, obey this authority figure, these are the rules, never break the rules. Mm-hmm. You can get freed of that, and people often gravitate back to something like that. And I never thought about it that way, but you're right, that Janeway becomes her kind of new Borg queen in a lot of ways. And so let me ask you this: does this comparison make sense to you, especially as our DC guy? Where she winds up is she sort of feels like she wants law and order, but the people who should be doing law and order, the Federation, aren't doing it. So she's going to kind of do this paradox of she's going to go outside of the realm of law and order in order to kind of instill her own version of it.
Yeah.
They call her a vigilante.
Right. Well, as you say, to me, that feels very Batman.
Yeah,
like
for sure.
His idea of like, because the Gotham City Police can't do this, I have to do this anyway.
I think it's a closer approximation to say she's more like the Punisher.
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially with the killing of Vajazel, and she kills multiple people needlessly in the season, and that's her. She's a murderer, but she murders for good, and that's the question: or can you be that? And she's struggling with that in that entire episode where she decides whether to go kill Vajazel or not.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved it. And I'm not one to watch a character be like, I can't like this character anymore because they did a thing I disagree with. Well, this person had reasons to do it, and I like to see that play out. Like, I don't have a problem with Spike becoming a good guy in Buffy.
Yeah.
He is a serial killer, to be clear.
Yeah, for sure.
But he was redeemed in some way.
Yeah.
And
it's that story of, that people are complex, that people aren't just mustache twirlers or heroes. To me, I love when a character does something I disagree with, but I understand why the character would do it. It's when the character does something that feels out of place for the character that it feels weird to me.
Yeah.
So let's just go back to the character Picard himself then. What obviously we're not really thrilled with how he ends up, but what did you think of the journey that he takes the rest of the show? Like, just starting with his decision to kind of leave Starfleet. I forget what the person who he travels with all the time in this season. I can't remember her name. Raffi. She's obviously very angry at him for giving up, as she says. But what's your take on his decision to leave Starfleet when he does?
They called his bluff, man. He had to go.
Yeah.
Like, he couldn't just be like, I'm just kidding. I'm going to put my badge back on. He can't show up Monday and act like nothing ever happened.
Yeah, I disagree with that, though. I think he could have done something outside. If this were Kirk, he would have said, screw you, I'm going and stealing a Klingon warbird and going to go save as many people as I can,
Yeah.
Yeah, he would have. You're right.
And that's what I wanted out of that. I think that's what Raffi wanted out of Picard. Raffi was like, you just stopped. They called your bluff and you just stopped. And yeah. And I think Picard was tired and everything he believed in wasn't working.
That goes back to what I was saying earlier, is like, Kirk was used to that. Kirk was like, dude, Federation's going to pick the wrong side like 9 times out of 10. They're going to choose the wrong course of action. I'm going to do this and they'll demote me, but it's what I want anyway. But Picard is so hung up on an ideal that he got his feelings hurt. And he decided to quit. Like, if they're not going to be that's what he says in that interview, is he's like, it was no longer Starfleet.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're breaking down over it still.
And you're no longer Starfleet now. You you could have kept the ideal alive, and that's very much what Seven is doing. They have a conversation in his little chateau. He says, I don't really think vigilantism is the way to go. You should trust the law. And she's like, there is no law here. Like, I am the only protection these people have. And I would even push back, like you talked about her wanting to be the law. I think she just wants to protect people. She wants to protect people in the best way she can. It doesn't matter if it's law. And I think that goes with, characters like the Punisher or Batman or whoever. They don't as much care about the law. They care about just saving people, the good of people over, any sort of law, which is hard to navigate because then you're breaking laws to try to do the right thing, but as a society, we've agreed these laws are what's best, and so what gives you the right to do that? And that makes for interesting storytelling.
I just want to reiterate, I am so happy with where Seven ultimately winds up, or where we find her in this series, because it's true, man. She was taken as a little girl. She basically is a combination of Batman and Punisher. She was taken, she was, indoctrinated into a cult. taken out of that cult and then put into another cult, the cult of Starfleet. And now she's just like, no, I'm my own person. That's what is so great that she becomes the Borg Queen for just that short amount of time where she's like, no, okay, I'm taking control of all these people. And we're going to do what's right for just a second.
Right.
And we're all going to suffer the consequences, but it's what's right.
I know we're talking ethics here, but just from a storytelling perspective, that episode is one of my least favorite because that plot line is relegated to about 5 minutes of screen time because they're telling the story of the ship and like the crew members sort of coalescing and telling the truth, and you find out about Rios's past, and you find out about the what happened to his captain and all that stuff. So they're telling that's all kind of the A story, and it's very much relegated to a B story. But for Seven, taking control, unless she does this all the time, which I don't think so, like that should have been, to me, like that should have been a season finale on a 7 of 9 show if she has to take control of a Borg cube. Yeah. And then for all of those Borg to die while connected to her, like that seems like it would be horrible and painful, and like it would really scar her. And then she does scream, and she does like bandy about whether she should take control or not, but she doesn't do it for long. It just felt like that should have been a huge deal in Seven's life, and it's a B plot on someone else's show. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. If they never bring it up again and nothing ever happens of it, I'm going to agree with you 100%.
Right. Maybe she'll have some sort of psychological scarring over it, is what you're saying.
It certainly seems like they are setting something up.
Yeah.
It seems like they set up, they had some, little clues that it screwed with her, that she didn't want to do it in the first place.
The voice of the Borg says Annika has work to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's that.
I'm not sure if that's the global voice of the Borg having plans for Annika, or Annika as the Borg letting the Borg know that she needs to release now because she has other stuff to do. She can't stay, I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Is that like some sort of Borg omniscience, or is that like her telling the Borg, I have things to do, I can't stay here?
I truly don't believe that they knew what they were doing. I don't think they... I think they were just like, hey, what would be cool if she says Annika still has work to do? What does that mean? I don't know. We can explore that later.
I'm afraid you're right there. I'm hoping it's not the case, but I'm afraid you're right. And
it's a mystery box.
One thing I've heard is that the next season is going to be more of an ensemble show. And like this season was very much Picard and Picard's journey. And that the next season will be a little bit broader in that, which I would certainly enjoy. And I think seeing Seven's story explored. One thing I do want to say, though, is we on this podcast, we have a sort of ethical moral framework, but part of why I wanted to invite you guys on was because I think you two talk about ethics and morality on your Picard and your other TV podcasts far more than you think. Because I kind of think that and so Matt, when you said let's stop talking about ethics and talk about the story, to me there's ethical ramifications of everything we're just talking about.
Sure, no. I think there's a lot of ethical ramifications of what happened, and like there's a lot of discussion to be had about what happened. I think that me complaining about the weight they gave it in the story does feel a little just petty fanny. It doesn't feel like I'm discussing ethics. It feels like I'm just complaining, which that's why I'm like, I know this isn't where we do this, but I can't help it. I really hated that part. Mm-hmm. It's like, mm-hmm.
No, I feel the same way when we go on about stuff like that.
Yeah, I know.
Let me offer this perspective, and maybe this is my just justifying the fact that this is half an ethics podcast and half a fan podcast, but I think it makes sense. I think the way shows raise interesting ethical questions and then don't resolve them or choose not to further address them, I think is itself an ethical issue. And so I think that's why everything we're talking about in terms of what are the questions that the show raises but then doesn't explore, it makes for bad storytelling, but it's also interesting from that perspective of what are the issues a story is or isn't willing to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, though. I don't know who listens to Arrow on this show, or who watches Arrow on this show, or who watched Arrow, I should say.
It's been a while.
But there's an episode. There is an episode where Oliver Queen is the mayor of Star City, and they are trying to figure out how to pass a gun law.
Oh, exactly what I think you're talking about. Yep.
And they never come down. They never actually say how they resolve it. It's just, we're going to sit in a room and we're going to work until we figure out our gun law for this city.
That's how they end these episodes. I do vaguely remember this episode.
And it's like Oliver is going to have a thing that he says, and Oliver's going to make a thing, and we're going to come together on this. No more, no more arguing over this. We're going to figure it out. And I know what they were going for. They were going for, we will please everybody. But even Guggenheim has come out and said, no, we should have come down on one way or the other on this thing. We should have had this happen.
I will say I did like in that storyline how they allowed different characters to have different perspectives on it, and they did allow them to express the different sides of the argument. So and if they're trying to solve the issue between all those characters, it's kind of impossible to do because it's in our world. It's proved impossible thus far. So I can't blame the show for trying something like that, but it does feel like a cop out to be like, now we're going to go solve it off screen.
I feel like a lot of shows try to do something similar where they're like, we are raising lots of ethical problems here, or ethical questions at the very least. And, no one has ever been able to really suss out what the correct thing to do is. Everyone has different opinions in the real world. So for us to force that upon any of our viewers, we're going to make people angry. Maybe it's better. Maybe it makes us a stronger show. Maybe it's better writing if we let them come up with what they think the solution is. We make the show a talking point, and that way the show lives on in people's heads rent-free, and we get to move on and not actually solve anything on our own show.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting balance, and I'm amused a little bit about this because so Dave, I watched a lot of Arrow. I eventually had to give up because life got so busy, but and that is your fault. Your DC podcast got me interested enough in Arrow to watch it. And actually, back when this Superhero Ethics project was both a blog and a podcast, I wrote an article specifically about that episode that I will put in the show notes here because I think it to me, I think that what we're getting at here is a really good illustration of I don't necessarily want a show that gives me answers. And frankly, I've loved a lot of Star Trek that raises questions, and Matt, as you said, lets different characters offer different perspectives. And it has the characters go in a particular direction, but the show isn't saying they're right or wrong. It's saying this is what the characters choose, and you as the audience would have to figure out how you would choose. And I feel like, I think, Matt, it was you and I who were talking about this recently, but I recently was brought up for me the episode of Deep Space Nine where basically Garak and Sisko are trying to get the Romulans into the war on their side, and Sisko's faced with a situation where he basically helps Garak assassinate or sort of tolerates Garak assassinating someone.
Yep.
And that to me is a great issue where it's sort of saying this is a hard question, and the show doesn't say Sisko's 100% right. It says this is what he has to do, and maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. We're leaving that question open. To me, that's very different than what the Arrow show did, where it was just more there's no real answer, let's not even bother. That felt to me much more that felt more cowardly, I think, than the way I think Star Trek's explored it, and where I think Picard did that on a lot of good issues. It just didn't do it on some of the key ones that we'd kind of had built up from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Pale Moonlight's such a good episode.
Yeah.
Oh my
really
God.
It really is.
I always say it's my favorite Star Trek episode. It is so complex and interesting. It's just so different, the way it has the wraparound of Sisko talking throughout it, and just the Garak is always a fun character to follow along with, and I just love that episode.
Mm-hmm. So Picard, though, going back to what we were saying about the his decision with the Romulans, I do feel like that is his moral arc in the show, is that it at the start of the show he's presented as he was faced with this decision and he just kind of backed away. And I like the comment you made about comparing him to Kirk, because to my mind it's a great illustration of how Kirk was always much more of a cowboy. Picard was someone who really believed in the Federation and thought the Federation mostly was going to do the right thing, especially because by the time that happened, he kind of was the Federation. He was the admiral of the flagship and all this kind of stuff, and then the person everyone looked to. So I could believe that when his ideal in the Federation shattered, it was a lot harder for him versus Kirk, who, like you said, was the Federation's doing something dumb. It's Tuesday. Even though I don't fully agree with the decision he makes at the end, part of the point is that here he's willing to make a stand where he wasn't at the start of the season, and that's kind of his arc of that he's kind of getting a redemption for the mistakes he made at the start. Does that sound fair to you all?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think that's what they're going for sure.
And I don't know how I think one of the problems with Picard might be that, as they always champion, they have fans writing the show.
Yeah.
But I have never really looked at Picard as like this great big savior. Everyone's like, oh, he's like this like paragon of ethics, and he's this guy that could just like come in and knows the exact right thing to do. And I've always kind of seen him a little bit ever since the episode where he's like, yeah, I started buckling down and doing what, everything I was supposed to do because I was stabbed through the heart. When he's telling Wesley in that shuttlecraft, and I was like, oh, you saw your reckless behavior hurt you and you became a coward.
Yeah. So
the Federation, their protocols, everything that you follow religiously, everything that's by the book that you adhere to, that's your crutch.
I think coward might be a little harsh.
It does seem harsh. You don't want to think of Picard as a coward, and he's certainly redeemed himself by this point. He's not a coward at this point.
I don't think he ever really was a coward.
Are you saying he wasn't a coward when he said, "You're no longer Starfleet, I'm done," and he didn't help those people?
I wouldn't say a coward, no. I would say that he was petty, and I would say a lot of things about him. I don't think he necessarily even like considered.
He let people die because he was butthurt.
Yeah, no, and I think that's different than cowardice, though.
I don't think it is.
I think what I would describe him getting to is activist burnout. Which, I work in the nonprofit world, and this is something we talk about a lot, is that the reason why it's important to do self-care and to not get so invested and to really sacrifice all of yourself is because it becomes so possible for you to just be so disappointed that you just throw your hands up and say, like, I can't do anymore. To me, it keeps going back to his hubris, that he was just so convinced that if he made the right, just cause to Starfleet, that they would shift. And in some ways, and I don't know if I'm getting too meta here, and maybe I'm giving the writers far too much credit, I think you could see that in some ways as a brilliant commentary on so much of early Star Trek, especially the original series, because that's often the biggest conceit is no matter what the alien race or computer logic or demigod that Kirk is talking to, if Kirk uses logic and reason and show and emotion, but if he kind of makes a case to the other side, they will always back down. And it seems like, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seems like maybe kind of what they were trying to say is that Picard was very much like that, and his world shattered when he realized that didn't always work.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I just, given the Picard we just saw in Insurrection 2 movies ago or whatever, where he sees the Federation not doing the right thing and he, causes an insurrection. Like, I don't know. I guess I just would have seen him. Maybe the problem was just too big for him. He didn't think he could solve it on his own. It's
an interesting commentary, I think, on where this all started, because I was talking about how, for my mother at least, I think for many people, whether or not this was exactly Roddenberry's vision, the original series is all about hope. It's all about the hopefulness of that technology and science and will cure all of our problems. And for me, I feel like Picard's quitting is more than anything, it's about him giving up hope. And that what the season is about is how he finds his hope again. But I find I think it's very easy for me to be very critical of Picard, but I also think I can very much understand it. And I've known both colleagues and friends of mine, but also, pretty highly placed people who, during very difficult, political or economic times have said, I just can't keep fighting this fight. I wish Picard would have chosen differently, but I also feel like it really fits his character.
I think I'm seeing something here, and I think it may be what the difference between these two characters. I think Picard has always been a part of Starfleet and has always he's done the right things for all these years, partially out of hubris. Like, he's done the right things because he believed that's who he was. Whereas someone like Seven does the right things despite what she thinks it means about her. She has left the Federation and joined the Fenris Rangers and is killing people because she thinks it's the right thing to do, even though it kind of makes her hate herself a little bit. Whereas Picard, it's part of his hubris, the fact that, like, he believed in the Federation ideal so much, and he believed he was the Federation ideal, that when he sees that's not going to work for him, maybe he's not the person that goes and saves all those people on his own. He's the person who believes in the ideal, and when the ideal isn't there, or there's no, like, system to support him, he's not that guy.
I feel like we and the fans tend to look at Picard's character through rose-colored glasses, though. When you look back at TNG, you remember the guy that stood up for Data in Measure of a Man. You don't remember the guy who was like, that's not a person, that's a Borg. Kill it in iBorg.
Yeah, no, for sure.
You don't remember necessarily the First Contact guy who was like, you'll be doing them a favor if you just kill them.
Yeah.
You tend to shy away from the guy in Journey's End who's like, no, this is for the greater good. We're going to take these Native Americans, basically, whatever they, off of this planet and give it to the Cardassians and not stand up for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I wish they had mentioned in Insurrection as him being like, I made a mistake once.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do that again.
Agreed.
I think that's a very good point, especially because I think, and I was kind of thinking about this before when you're talking about where Picard has been and how this show is kind of a reaction to the fans. The romanticization of the character, the rose-colored glasses, the romanticization of the character Picard, I think has been really strong over the last 20 years. And I think especially because, and I know you guys, I think, are higher on Discovery than I am, but not even putting aside our personal opinions, I know for an awful lot of fans, Discovery was very disappointing in that it wasn't what they wanted from Trek. And I, at least a lot of what I saw when Picard first got announced was, oh, thank God we'll have real Trek again instead of Discovery. And I don't even get into whether how accurate that is, because I think a lot of people could dispute that. But I think because of that, it became, we want Picard to be not TNG all over again, but our memory 20 years later of TNG. And yeah, that gets into all sorts of questions about the writer's responsibility to give the fans what they want versus to be true to the original characters versus all this kind of stuff.
I'll tell you what you get when they do a reunion. When writers make a reunion show that caters to the rose-colored glasses, you get Return to Mayberry. And you watch it and you go, this doesn't feel right. I don't know what it is. I can't put my hand... Because the show was never that.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Like, it wasn't just feel-good moments with characters that have no consequence.
Right.
Which is what Return to Mayberry was. And that's what a lot of like reunion shows wind up doing that just never feel right. Like, if you don't have a story to tell, don't do it. I feel like Picard had a story to tell, whether or not we agreed with where it wound up. Now, I love where Picard as a character wound up. I think it was, beautiful.
You mean dead?
Well,
sorry.
I mean, yeah, I know. It's ha. But I think it's great that he winds up as the very thing he fought to preserve. All the way back in Measure of a Man, he fought for Data's rights, and now he finds that he himself is a synth.
Yeah. First of all, Matt, you should know he's not dead. He just had his stack re-sleeved.
Oh, gotcha.
That's right.
I see.
It's an Altered Carbon reference for anyone who hasn't seen that show. But I think that's right. I do love the journey he goes on and where he winds up, and I'm really hoping to see where that gets explored in the next season. And also just going back to what we're talking about with 7 of 9, because you all helped me really put this into even better perspective. One thing I'm thinking about with both 7 and Picard is, I think it was you, Dave, you're talking about how the difference in those two characters and how a lot of it has to do with how they see themselves. Part of it for 7 is that she has never been able to, until now, define her own identity. Like, she was taken in by the Borg and made a part of the Borg, and then leaving the Borg and becoming part of Starfleet are not in any way her choice. She's forcibly cut away from the Borg and then basically forced to, well, you can't just leave the starship. You have to become part of the Federation. And part of what I'm seeing is that Fenris Rangers is the first time where she gets to define for herself who she wants to be without someone else telling her this is who you should be. And that makes a marked difference to Picard, who's kind of always had to do that, but is now having to wrestle with what's his own image of himself.
Yeah.
Another thing, and you just mentioned some Altered Carbon love. I just edited the episode we recorded yesterday, and we talked about this idea they brought up in Altered Carbon. So no spoilers for Altered Carbon, just a little mention of a concept here. One of the things they talk about in the last episode is going through hardships helps you understand the hardships of others.
Right.
And then combine that with the character of Bancroft in Altered Carbon, who is a character who has lived a long life of privilege and really only views himself through the lens of how he sees himself. Like he does the good things he does is because he wants to view himself that way.
Let's be careful not to spoil Altered Carbon for anyone, but yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah. I think that's all I'm saying about Altered Carbon. But I thought it was an interesting parallel to draw between like Kovac to Seven versus Bancroft to Picard, if that makes sense. Seven, who has been through a lot of struggles and has seen struggle, and so when she sees people out on the edge of the Fenris area, she feels like she needs to get out there and help them. Whereas Picard has always done these good things out of a view of himself, and once his paradigm is destroyed, he kind of recedes and isn't doing the things he could do to help others.
Well, and it gets into that same question because, you know, a lot of what we talked about on that episode of Altered Carbon was how much it matters with not only just are your own suffering, but are you seeing the suffering from others, or are you somewhat protected from that? And for Seven, what's happening out on those planets, I mean, that's her lived experience. She's seeing that her friends, their loved ones, herself are suffering because of it. Whereas for Picard, like, he might think what's happening to the synths is terrible and what's happening to the Romulans is terrible, but it doesn't really touch his life. You know, his actual day-to-day existence is not in any way affected by those things. He mentally knows about them, but they're not impacting him in the same way that he kind of has the ability to sort of shut it all off, the way if it was actually like, you know, directly happening to him, he of course wouldn't be able to. Right. So that's also, I think, an interesting twist on the character.
It also all kind of ties together when you think about his answer to that question of why did you leave the Federation? He didn't say because they let a lot of people die. He says because they weren't the Federation anymore. It's like the identity of the thing was so important to him.
Well, he was all tied up in it.
Sure.
Which is weird after Insurrection.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. I think Insurrection's a very bad movie, but it raises some really interesting questions, and it takes characters on really interesting journeys. I think I've always been frustrated that it seemed to have no effect, because it seemed like, in some ways, Insurrection was as much a, you know, break with Roddenberry as anything on DS9. But then, after Insurrection, we're right back to everything's hunky-dory with the Federation, in a way that made no sense to me.
Well, it was just like many other Star Trek episodes where it was one admiral was doing or a few admirals were doing a bad thing.
Right.
And I would push back on it being a bad movie. I think it's one of the better of the TNG era. I mean, there's only a few, but I like Insurrection.
Yeah, I have my issues with Insurrection, certainly. Pulling Data back to his TNG character and not exploring his emotions or where we left him at the end of First Contact. I'm like, dude, there were kids on the Enterprise D. Like, how are you not familiar with children or playing? Yeah. Like, you played with every person on that ship. You talked to every person on that ship about how to be a human. That is stupid. It's just stupid. Yeah. But I liked all the stuff about, you know, learning to live inside of a moment, and I liked all the you know, the stuff about choosing to eschew technology in favor of a richer life.
It's interesting how many Star Trek movies are about living in the moment. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of that. It's interesting.
Well, Generations is about living in a moment over and over again.
Right.
Well, yes, but it was also very much about living in the moment. Like it's very much about Tully and Soren being stuck on the past, and Kirk not being willing to live in the Nexus, or Picard not being willing to live in the Nexus.
You have that great line at the end of Generations where Picard is telling Riker, someone told me that time is a predator that stalks us all our lives, but I rather think of time as a companion that reminds us to cherish each moment, for it won't come again.
Good accent.
No, it's terrible.
No, there's some good things there. And I'll admit, you're very welcome to take any opinions I have on Star Trek movies with a huge grain of salt, because I kind of like Nemesis, which I know makes me very, very weird.
That's rough, man. That's rough.
But I just think there's some fun parts to it. But yeah, so getting back to this, we've talked a lot about Picard and Seven, and I think we could certainly go much deeper, but I want to cover at least a couple other things before we go too long. So let's talk about the androids themselves. Because again, here, I feel like we didn't get the story we wanted, but we did get kind of an interesting story still. And let's just kind of start with the whole idea of what happened on Mars, because I feel like it raised some really interesting questions, even though it gave us kind of a dumb answer. But in just like the first half of the season, when we were wrestling with this idea of, like, what if androids did rise up because they were enslaved, and how would we deal with that? Like, what was your kind of your thinking on how those questions were playing out, at least in the first part of the series?
I enjoyed all the questions. I didn't like any of the answers.
Yeah.
I think what was interesting is no one in the Federation ever, and I see, that's part of the problem, is that it was just sort of like controlled by, secret group of Romulans, because I still think it was like they had their own agenda, and their agenda was, that, look, the sentient life are going to be the death of us all. And that's why we didn't get a chance to have like the real question at hand, which, how stupid would it be if one incident like this happens and they actually did put a synth ban, because they're androids. These weren't even like particularly, intelligent androids.
Right.
They could do menial tasks. The question is, or the obvious thing is, someone had to put them up to this. Someone had to program this inside of them. Any, intelligent person could say, "Hey, Bruce, how likely is that?" And he would be like, "That's not likely at all." Like, right. They're drones. They're nothing.
Well, I think there's still a valid story to be told there. Not that all the parallels are there, but I mean, this is very much the 9/11 type of storyline where you had a people that attacked, and now all of the members of the Federation hate those people that attacked, regardless of whether they were involved or whatever. Anyone that resembles the people that were responsible for this attack,
As far as that is concerned, Enterprise did it better with the Suliban. But this in this situation, these aren't even really synthetic life. Like the guys who did, or the androids who did this with the Mars station, they were fancy robots. They weren't androids. They weren't synthetic life, not for real.
Yeah, they say that even, and like I just hated that whole thing, because then it basically makes the entire synth ban not matter until we find out there's a race of people on this planet who are actively ready to destroy us.
And I'm like, and I'm confused by the Federation, because I'm like, okay, so you are going to ban physical synthetic life, but keep all the holograms. Yeah. All the holograms who have caused way more problems over the course of Star Trek.
Yeah, I'm when my partner and I just moved, and so we had TNG on as kind of our like in the background TV while we're packing boxes and stuff. In part because it's enjoyable and we've seen it before, and also because it's not really that subtle a TV show in the first few seasons, so you can miss some parts and still know what's going on. But yeah, we're remarking how the first time the holodeck is introduced in a real way, we get Dixon Hill, and then immediately problems start happening with it. But I like what you're saying there, because the way the synths were presented here as kind of like mindless robots, the ban on them is almost like a form of gun control. Because it's like saying, like, these things are tools, and if the wrong person gets control of them, the tools can do too much damage, so we're going to ban them. And I feel like this is just my whole problem with the season, is the lack of agency, because the story I was really excited about was one where the synths were more like Data, not entirely, but, you know, that they had their own minds and they had their own motivations and were able to, you know, kind of say, wait a minute, what if we don't want to do this dangerous work that the humans are asking us to do? What if we, and I actually think it could be such especially like, I would imagine to a group like that, Data would be such a hero, you know, and the memory and the idea of like all of them doing this in the name of, like, what if a story where like, you know, someone started proselytizing about Data standing up to Maddox in Measure of a Man and saying like, so we should, you know, throw off our human overlords in the name of Data. And Picard being forced to confront, like, he knows Data would never want this kind of violence, and how does he deal with that? Now we're just rewriting the show entirely, but that would have been such a more interesting question.
They gave us this tease with they announced Bruce Maddox is going to be in the show, and so and then they show us this like race like of an army of androids in a closet, and you're like, oh man, that's
what they're doing.
The entire episode, Measure of a Man, the whole crux is we don't want to create an army of beings to enslave, and then they do it, and that is never even addressed. Like, that is not an issue on the show, and that is the huge wasted potential.
Absolutely.
Something else I'm just realizing that's a kind of a plot hole to me about the holograms. They say in an early part of this season, they talk about how Romulan ships don't have any complex AIs, like including on the ship. Like, they don't really have an AI that runs the ship because of their fear of these synthetic life. But why would they fight so hard to destroy the androids and not mind that there's ships like Rios is running around with tons of holograms controlling the ship?
Not even that. We have a hologram in charge of that storage facility, in charge of that Starfleet. But I tell you why. Because even the secret government agents know you can't take away the people's photons. If you take away the people's photons, suddenly they can't have sex with anybody they want, and there will be riots in the streets.
Give them photonic bread and circuses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know what? That's actually really. I was mostly joking, but you're right. Like, that is their form of television. They have, you know, holonovels and stuff.
It's more like brothels and circuses, but yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, bread, brothels, same thing.
I mean, we could do an entire episode on the ethics of holographic situations, especially because, I mean, that's. And I think DS9 gets into this a little bit. Is sort of the. But it's a similar question to something like Altered Carbon raises or Westworld raises, which is another favorite show of mine. But it's this idea of, if I give you the opportunity to live out your darkest, like, most awful, like, you shouldn't do this in the real world, but I give you the chance to live that out in a setting with holographic or robotic people, and so it doesn't count. Is that good?
Is it good or bad for your psyche? Yeah, it's a good question. I heard you guys talk about that on the AI episode last week. And I don't know. I'd have to hear research on it. And I'm sure there's some sort of research on some type of, you know, psychological intervention like that, like where you either, kind of like what we see in Altered Carbon, where she fights, to explain to Dave, someone is violently attacked. So the way they help them psychologically is to teach them to fight, like, and have them learn to fight and box. And like, that's one of the ways they work through their issue. Yeah. I don't know if that's better or if that's something that's actually pushing them in a violent direction that's worse for them.
Yeah. Now, you know, when we were talking about synthetic life at the beginning of the series, I was excited to broach the topic of holograms and how they relate to all of this. And like you probably heard on our show, we thought the Doctor was probably going to be in charge of everything. Yeah. Like, he was going to be the big bad guy because photons be free.
Yeah, he wrote a holonovel called Photons Be Free, yeah.
I've often wondered, you know, when you have situations, they had an episode where Moriarty gained sentience. Like, he was like, I know, this isn't real. Right. We have people like Vic Fontaine. And, you know, for all of the great things in Deep Space Nine, I don't feel like they ever really, they never really went into like, hey, you know how we keep erasing all of these like female these female holograms in Quark's holosuite, and then like making them have sex with all these different people? Is that rape? Is that, you know, prostitution? What is this? Do they feel anything? Do they remember anything? Vic does. Once Vic was like left on all the time, he should have been an advocate for photonic life.
Yeah.
I would be way more interested to find out how they tie in with the synthetic life ban and why they weren't chosen to be shut down. Maybe the Federation relies too heavily on them.
Yeah.
And the androids are still not there yet. And they were an easy target.
They're also easier to control. You know what I mean? Like, it's easier
to turn them off.
Yeah, you can easily turn all the hollow emitters off. I mean, who knows? Maybe part of the synth ban was they built in fail safes to be able to cut off any hollow emitter at any time. I'd love to hear that story of how the Doctor with his mobile emitter was treated after the synth ban. We talked about it on our podcast, so I won't retread that over and over. But man, I want to know how he dealt with this, but we don't get that story.
I have always felt, and I will grant you, Voyager is I think my favorite of the Star Trek TV shows, and I will say that because, granted, I watched all of it immediately after major surgery on my leg when I was high on morphine, so I might have been somewhat affected by these things.
Oh, that makes sense.
But I do feel like the way it explored these questions of holographic life, especially with the Doctor, but also just some of the things it did in the holodeck. And I think I mentioned this on the AI episode, but I'll just say it again briefly. The episode in which they're all sort of spending time in this mythical Irish town, and Janeway is kind of dating a guy in that. But when she finds like there are things about him that annoy her, instead of going through the things that people have to do in relationships of trying to figure out how to mediate that, she just says, computer, can you turn his laugh down a few degrees? Or can you, change this part of his subroutine? And to me, that's kind of a very similar issue to what we're talking about that we wanted to see here, because that's all about saying, like, these holograms or these people, these androids, only exist for us. And so we get to change them and alter them, exactly as we want them to be. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so it's one thing I would have loved to see them explore more here.
You mean there was something thoughtless on Star Trek and Janeway was involved?
Yeah, I know. Voyager's not the perfect show, and the Kazon were terrible, and I'll agree with all. And Neelix is. I probably have the romanticized vision of Voyager, because in my version, Neelix never appears. So
how did you manage that?
I kind of want now someone to do the how someone did the Phantom edit of the Phantom Menace, where they cut out Jar Jar Binks entirely. I want someone to do that to Voyager, maybe even a couple episodes, and just cut out Neelix entirely. Mm-hmm.
I think Neelix was like my least favorite character on Voyager, and somehow I have like 3 action figures of him. And I'm like, how did that happen?
Well, and let's go to one more question about androids, and then kind of maybe wrap up with 1 or 2 last questions. And Dave, I know you brought this one up. The question of Data's decision to die. What to you is kind of interesting about that decision he makes there?
I get that he has died and he made the decision to die. I'm curious, does this version of Data that was basically, I would assume, he was extracted from B4.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So he had not made the decision to die yet. So he hadn't like let that set in.
Well, he has had 30 years to he's been told about it. I think they talk about it.
Yeah, he's been told about it. So one, he's a copy of Data. He's not Data. But he's still got a lot to offer the universe. Like, there's a whole raft of androids that need guidance.
Right.
And he has been an android and living among humans and organic life for all these years. He could offer a lot of guidance. He could offer, a helping hand. He's still, smart as crap. Got a ton of experience. And I think what we're dealing with here is we were robbed of a logical decision from the character, because the actor doesn't remember the canon of the show and doesn't remember that Data has an aging chip. That was mentioned in the episode with his synthetic mother in season 7.
Is that a problem with the actor or with the writers?
That's both. That is absolutely both. Mm-hmm. And it is infuriating. But
yeah, Dave gets really frustrated with that because they have all these conversations about how they need to get him back to looking like he did in Nemesis or like he did in TNG, and like on the show he talks about how he has an aging chip. So
yeah, and not only that, Brent Spiner gives any number of interviews a week where he's just like, it was just really important that we like take care of Data and give him some closure because it's just not realistic to keep playing him. I can't keep looking the same, and I'm like, you are an idiot. They used one line to fix this entire problem and explain why you, Lore, your mother, all of you age. You have an aging chip. Does it sound stupid? Absolutely, it sounds stupid. Does it work for the canon? Absolutely, it works for the canon. It's no more stupid than Time Crystal.
Yeah.
It's like in Firefly when Wash says, that sounds like something from science fiction. Yeah, you live on a spaceship, dear. Shut up.
Yeah, I get you. I think I have a little more sympathy for him because of both actors and writers. I wish they'd kind of been more honest to the canon, but I think there's a couple of canon breaks that I understand. I've seen remember someone commenting that they have the wrong model of a starship at one point. I don't remember details about that. But I do think though that and I think you're right. There's a lot of ways in which Data might have made the other choice. But I do think that actually Data choosing this is kind of canon because what he's basically first of all, I am a kind of generally on the side of euthanasia and like the idea that if someone wants to die, they get to die no matter what sort of benefit they bring to others. But I also think it fits with Data because basically what he's saying here is, yes, I could be of benefit to others if I kept living, but I don't want to. I want to die, and so that's what should matter. And in Measure of a Man, going all the way back to that, he kind of was faced with a mirror situation where basically, if Maddox is correct, there could be incredible benefit to humankind, to all sentient life, and maybe future robotic life by studying Data, but he might have to die for that to happen. And Data's thought is that my own will to live should supersede the benefit that could happen to others of my continued existence. And so I like to hear it's the exact flip side of it. It's that my desire to die should supersede my benefit to other existence. So I guess to me, in that regard, it feels very canonical, though I agree with you, they screwed up the aging chip stuff. Does that connection feel right, or do you see it differently?
I somewhat feel like it is... Like, I would have liked to have known or heard from Data more of a reason why he wanted to die. Like, if he had to stay in that mind space, in that like unreality, then sure, I get it. If he, in fact, though, had, they could make a golem for him. Right. And, and they could have had him played by a different actor. They could have had the golem age as they have Picard age, and then Brent Spiner could look human. He's the most human he's ever been. Data could have been more like, and he's even talking about coming back as Soong's real son. So I'm like, this is stupid.
Yeah.
You could have literally just come back as Data, as an aging person Data.
That's the biggest problem for me is when you talk about like his canonical decisions, his entire driving force in all of the show was to be more human. And so for me, it would have been a much better end to his character if he had made a decision that put him in a body where he could actually have all the feelings and sensations and emotions of a human, because they have this new type of android that he could have easily been downloaded into. They had a golem sitting there. The writers could have easily written in 2 golems. They could have been one for Soong and one for Maddox, and then instead use it for Picard and Data. And maybe, like you said, maybe it's Soong's body was already programmed. You know what I mean? Like, right. So you just put him in a regularly aged Brent Spiner body and have him back as Data.
I could see that. I think certainly, Dave, the point you make of that, either way, we have to headcanon what Data wanted, because the show just didn't give us that. I mean, that could have been an entire episode, is, people coming to Data and talking about how much benefit he could have, and seeing Data really wrestle with that, but also the wanting to die, the wanting to be unplugged. When it was just sort of thrown in as his like, oh, by the way, Picard, can you do this? Let's talk about it for 30 seconds. That felt cheap. That felt unfair to the character and to Brent Spiner, because it felt like this is such a massive character move for the character, and it's given even less weight and less attention than, like Seven's character is getting.
And ironically, they say that the showrunners and Spiner have said that they did this to give closure to the Data character, better closure than what Nemesis had. But what we really got was more closure for Picard, not for anyone else, not for any of the other characters, and certainly not for the fans, because we do have to headcanon why Data would want to die, other than the fact that dying is an essential human thing. Well, guess what, buddy? If you were put into a golem, you would still die. They still let Picard, they gave Picard a certain amount of years, and then his body would deteriorate and he would die. You would still have the human experience, and we would still have an aging Brent Spiner in the show who didn't have to wear a lick of, makeup. Well, he would, but not that kind of makeup.
There is a cynical part of me that wonders if any part of this is the writers or even Brent Spiner saying, yes, Data got this, emotional death scene in a movie that most people think is terrible and quite a lot of people have never watched. Let's try it again in a better format. I hope that's not the case.
Nemesis was better.
Yeah, me too. I think that his death in Nemesis was better.
But I'm saying I wonder if that was the thought of like wanting to try it that way.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong.
Yeah.
They just failed.
Well, I don't want to keep us too long, but so let's go to one other question that I know we had, which is and her character actually kind of raises a whole bunch of questions. And I'm trying to stall while I find where I have the character's name written down.
You're talking about
Girardi, thank you. That I knew that all along. But so Girardi's character goes on quite I wouldn't even say an ethical arc. It's sort of an ethical pinball machine, because she's bouncing all over the place. But and talk about a whole bunch of different perspectives on agency.
Is she though? I don't know if she's bouncing a lot.
Well, so yeah, let's talk about it. What's your take on her character and the arc she takes?
I mean, she's fascinated with AIs, and then this Picard comes to her, and then before we ever see the second time, the first time she's just an exposition dump. She's a very friendly exposition dump, and then every moment after that, she's basically fighting the AIs, like the rest of the show. Yeah. She's doing it in secret, but she's just against the AIs, and even then she again convinces Sung and the androids that she wants to be there and save them, but still that's just a trick. Like, she's just deceptive. It's just funny because she's so sweet, and she's played by Alison Pill, and it's so nice to see her every week, but like she's very deceptive in the show, and it makes you trust her.
I don't
almost.
think she's. Well, what makes you trust her is not that she's deceptive, because she wasn't good at being deceptive. Like,
I disagree.
They did a good job. When you go back and look at it, you could see how eaten up she is by her deceptions, by like what she's got to say and what she's got to do, and what she knows what she ultimately has to do. They have these little tics, like, and she does a great job with it. She has these little like physical tics that you can kind of see, and you kind of think like, oh, she's just nervous about because she's never been really off world. She's never done any of that. No, man, she's eaten up. She knows what she's got to do, and she doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, that's all great in hindsight, but I don't think that's very visible from the beginning.
I think it's not visible from the beginning. You know something's wrong with her. Something's not quite up to snuff. But once you know what it is, you're like, they did a good job with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't. Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I just think that she's very deceptive throughout the show. Like, she's very deceives kind of everyone that she's on their side at any point, except for she's just trying to save the universe because there's some crazy thing in her head telling her to. She's effectively a Jacques Vache, like kind of where they came from, I guess.
Well, so let me ask you this: do you think she has agency in killing Maddox?
It's hard to know.
Yeah, it feels like she is it feels like she's a pawn. Like, she feels like she had to do it. I think she did have a certain amount of agency because she had a thing in her head, and even though she desperately didn't want to kill him, she felt like she had to.
Right.
But, then again, you could probably argue that Admiral O stuck that action in her head and made her follow through with it. And I'm interested to see where they'll go with that and how they'll argue that in the next season. I hope that it's not just oh yeah, here's a one-liner to explain why she's not in jail now.
Yeah, I'd like to see the trial of Girardi.
Yeah, Michael Chabon says that she hasn't had a chance to turn herself in yet. He says they will definitely dive into all of that when the next season comes about. So I'm really curious to see how they decide that it is going to play out. I
think me too, because I really liked the direction her character went, and I liked the idea that she did have some agency in killing him, and it was you could say she was very to me. I want her to have been manipulated, not mind controlled. Because then she does have to have some moral weight in what she's doing. And the degree to which she was kind of forgiven and forgotten at the end felt very off to me. And certainly her betraying the androids at the very end, there was nothing surprising to me about that.
I'm not a big fan of when shows leave things so ambiguous that it makes it okay for them to just operate with impunity. Everyone can forgive her. That we can have a plot line where she feels regretful because you think maybe she had agency, but everyone can forgive her because maybe she didn't. It's I'd rather you go down on one side or the other. Either she did or didn't, and then she either should be. Maybe she feels the weight of it, but she has to be learn to forgive herself because it's not something she really did, or she fully had agency and she did it and she's got to deal with that. And those are two very different stories. And I feel like they're kind of wanting us to fall in the middle, and I'm worried they're not going to clarify that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's sort of like how Voyager, the Maquis crew members were worried at the end of the 7 years when they were getting close that, they were going to be thrown in prison for being Maquis.
Yeah.
And I don't remember if they even went into that because they got all lost in the time traveling Janeway Borg of it all. But
I think there's one line about them being given a mass pardon, but I don't think there's anything more beyond that.
Which would have been it's way more interesting if they got back and been like, "Welcome back. You're going to jail, B'Elanna."
Yeah, that would have been a much better story.
Or they find out when they get back and they find out some of their actions as Maquis. Maybe B'Elanna had smuggled some weapons to someone and that actually caused a lot of damage to someone. These are the kind of plot lines I want.
They should have gotten back a year, the season before the ending.
Maybe that's why Seven is off with the Fenris Rangers, because, she finally gets in love with Chakotay, they get married, and then he gets arrested, thrown in jail immediately afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
I will say, I liked a lot about Girardi's plot line. I thought some of it was frustrating, because it felt like a lot of this show, they would creep up to an edge and then back away, but instead of taking that jump. And I think that's, it almost was so much of a tease. I will say there was one thing that I loved because it dealt with what has always been one of my biggest frustrations with Star Trek, which is that Star Trek has had this idea throughout the entire thing that we cannot ever have an actual serious understanding of how romance works anywhere in the Federation. It is always, you kiss someone once, which means you are now totally in love with them and have to deal with the consequences of being, completely in love with each other. And so to have Girardi basically use another character for sex because she needs to, not feel what she's feeling, which is not admirable, but incredibly human emotion and a reason why a lot of people turn to either drinking or sex or some other escape. I loved that because it was, I remember I watched Battlestar Galactica and I love so much about Star Trek, but one of the first episodes of Battlestar Galactica, I thought, wait, people can have human emotions about sex in space? This is allowed? And so I did love seeing Star Trek get on board that train of, it can be more complicated than either I don't admit I like you or we're totally in love with each other.
Which what would have been more interesting for them to do?
What's that?
If she had started having sex with the hospitality hologram.
I was going there.
And because in my head, in the 24th century, with these, almost the 25th now, with these highly evolved human beings, when they have moments like that, they're self-aware enough to go oh, I just need to feel something else. Let's not drag another person's feelings into this. We're going to have sex with a hologram. So She would go to the hospitality hologram, who looks just like Rios, and would, avail herself to him. and then slowly start to get emotions, feelings for Rios.
Oh, wow.
Because of what she's doing with the hologram.
That's some Barkley shit, man.
And if you think about like the archetype, that is totally Jurati. Like,
oh, of course.
I think it would have been really interesting for her to like be slowly, secretly developing feelings for Rios outside of the sex with the hologram, just because of who he is. But then also like started going from using the hologram for just to feel something else to using the hologram to exercise those feelings for Rios because he looks like Rios. And maybe even the hologram, the hospitality hologram, starts to realize what's going on and is like offended by that.
Mm-hmm. I personally like the messy emotions of the humans getting together. I think that's good for the show. And I think there's more to it than when you just say she wants to feel something else and she's just going to go to a hospitality hologram or a hologram in general. I think there's more to when you want to feel something else. Sometimes what you want to feel is valued, and that probably requires it to be a thing that has agency and choice. A person with agency choosing to have sex with you, not just a hospitality program.
But yes and no, because lots of people go to strip clubs because they develop what they think of as relationships with the sex workers there.
Sure, absolutely.
That's the person who cares for me. A lot of people can kind of fool themselves to the point of like thinking this is a serious relationship and isn't about the $20 I'm passing them every dance. And
well, that's my point exactly. I think you're supporting my point, not disagreeing with it though. It's like they go there because they want it to feel like it's more. You know what I mean?
I'm just saying that I think a lot of people can't, but some people can fool themselves. And I guess I'm saying, like, I feel like a lot of people, you're right, would go to a strip club or go to a hologram and say, this isn't the same thing. But I think Jurati is in that camp of people who could fool themselves, who could let themselves kind of get that, like, fan crush obsession.
Yeah, maybe. Well, I feel like with a hologram, it's different, though, with the fact that she knows it's an android or like a synthetic life that is programmed to do a certain thing. At least we think. We don't know how intelligent these AIs are.
I like my idea because it plays into like the overall themes of the series and where we were hoping it was going anyway.
Yeah, sure. That's also true.
That's true. Yeah, if they're playing with the AI of it all, I'm down.
Yeah. Well, especially because it kind of to take us back to the conversation we were having about like, you know, whether using the holodecks to live out sort of, you know, things that you maybe shouldn't be living out in the real world. It gets back to that whole question of, is it healthy or not? You know, is this harm reduction or is this just, you know, enabling problematic thoughts? I feel like the way you could look at a hologram in the best possible light in that regard is kind of the equivalent of methadone. You know, the whole concept of methadone is like, we can't break you of your heroin addiction, so we can give you something that feeds your addiction, but isn't dangerous in the same way. And hopefully will eventually wean you off of it. But it's aimed at sort of like saying you have this need and we're going to help you meet that need in a safe way. And so I'm kind of interested in this idea of like that holograms or holosuites or with like can be a sort of like, yeah, you want to do this thing and it's not really great. We don't want you to do that thing, but if we don't give you some outlet to do that thing, you might do it and terrible things can happen. So let's let you kind of do that in the holodeck. And Star Trek never went there because that's pretty dark, but I've always sort of thought of that as the, you know, the women in the Quark's, you know, holosuite things are not always probably fully consenting or you know, all the problems that can raise. So yeah, I agree with you, Dave. I think that could have been a really interesting thing to explore with Jurati's character. And also just a lot of fun when the real Rios confronts her.
And now I'm just thinking of the Federation and Starfleet as Seven of Nine's methadone to the Borg and how she wasn't weaned properly.
Oh yeah, that's very true. Well, I'm also just because like I have friends who are fanfic writers and some of them I think they're fantastic writers, but I've certainly known some who I think even they would admit they get pretty lost in the fantasy of it sometimes. And like I have one person who I know who they've intentionally pulled back somewhat on this, in part because he said he got to a point where he couldn't remember what a character had actually said canonically versus what a character had said in his fan fiction writings. Which I thought was such an interesting, like, yeah, like, and I think it's true of any fantasy, you know, like in the same way that we were talking about how people have 20 years of memories of Picard. That's not actually what Picard was. And I remember Voyager without Neelix because I remember the good parts. We've had a lot to talk about, a lot to say. We're coming up on the 2-hour mark, so I don't want to go too much longer. Is there any kind of last thoughts either of you all have that you want to throw in here? Any last things you wanted to cover?
I have nothing. I think we've exhaustively discussed the Picard series and its ethics.
Yeah.
I mean, I will talk about this for 8 hours, but we've probably reached the end.
Yeah.
Of this one.
Yeah.
Let's do it again next time.
Yeah. Maybe if we just come up with a whole lot more, like something about Rafi or so you don't Romulan guy.
Stop mentioning characters because I'm going to have a lot more to say, and we are almost at 2 hours.
Well, hopefully, when there is
ethical codes.
Stop it, Dave.
Dave, it's like you have a real ethical mind that you want to bring to these discussions.
I don't.
I will argue with you on that, but I will say this has been a fantastic conversation, and if and when we get a season 2, I'd love to have you back on to discuss kind of where we left some of these characters and what we're hoping to see from them in season 2. But thank you both, and let me give each of you a chance to kind of just say goodbye and tell us a little bit more about where to find your stuff. Dave, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm David C. Roberson. You can find me on the DC On Screen podcast, dconscreen.com. You can find me on the StarTrekUcast.com. That's the Star Trek Universe podcast I do with Matt, or Matthew Carroll, who is currently on this podcast.
That's me. I'm me.
And I do the Breaking Bond podcast with my wife. We're watching all of the James Bond movies, or really all the James Bond live action and possibly animated iterations in chronological order. Our pastor just made me aware of a 1964 comedy sketch that Roger Moore did where he played James Bond, a very paranoid James Bond, trying to vacation, 10 years before he was James Bond on the movies. So we're going to talk about that.
Nice.
And then, I haven't done them in years, but I've got a bunch of comedy sketches over on maladjusted.tv. So, a bunch of stuff. Maladjusted Media is what that's going to be, is starting to be called now. So.
I like it.
Neat.
And Mr. Carroll, what about yourself?
Like I said earlier, I'm Star Trek UCast, Star Trek Universe Podcast, Marvel Cinematic Universe Podcast, but really just check out strandedpanda.com. We're trying to do an update to the website this week where we're going to have everybody have their own page that shows all the shows they're on, so we'll all have all our shows in one place where we can be like, here's the guy and here's all his shows, and then all on each of the shows it shows all the guys on those shows, and you really get a place where we can actually point people to that they can really see a cross-reference of all of our work.
Are you going to do like Kurt Vonnegut and like give the penis sizes and everything when you introduce a guy?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Excuse me.
For sure.
No one told me this part when I signed up to be part of the Stranded Panda podcast network.
So penis size aside, that's where you can find us. StrandedPanda.com.
It's an unfortunate reminder that we have far too many only male hosts on the Stranded Panda podcast network at the moment. Or penis having people, not necessarily male, but yeah. Anyway, thank you guys both so much. And for everyone else, please, we have these conversations, as you heard, Matt and Dave have been watching the show because they love talking to each other about it. I watch it because I love talking to my mother about it. We all do these podcasts because we love talking about it. We like hearing our own voices, but I think more than anything, I know I've heard both Dave and Matt talk about this yourselves, we love to hear from you, the fans. So please tell us what you think. I'd love to hear your ethical thoughts or just thoughts in general on Picard. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Superhero Ethics. You can also email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. All those links will be in the show notes, as well as all the links that Dave and Matt both talked about. All that's going to be in the show notes as great ways to find all the great content that's out there. I hope everyone's staying safe. To those who are staying home, I hope that we're giving you some entertainment. To those of you who are out doing essential work, thank you for what you're doing, and we hope this gives gives a little smile to your face while you're doing that work or while you're driving to and from. Stay safe, everybody, and have a great day.